And joining me today is a great South African writer, Chris Waldburger, who I've known for a very long time and who introduced me to the concept of something called liberal tyranny, which sounds ironic on the face of it, but once you read a bit deeper, it makes complete and utter sense. So, Chris, welcome to the Roman Empire podcast.
Thanks very much, Roman. I think that the last time you hosted me was in 2021 when I'd written a piece about the riots, the South African riots, the July riots, and I'd written a piece maybe better than liberal tyranny was the Sam Francis term, anarcho-tyranny. And then I kind of said, well, I think we've escalated that to what I called liberal terror. Yeah, and I recall, the general idea there in 2021 was we'd come out from such a highly policed period in South African history, probably the most highly policed period probably in the world. And then anarchism was allowed to, was set loose upon us for a few weeks. Yeah, but great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Only a pleasure. So you run on Substack quite a lot, and a lot of people might be thinking to themselves, like anarcho-tyranny, liberal tyranny, what do these things actually mean? So let's go back to COVID, the pandemic in air quotes. You wrote a phenomenal piece about what liberal tyranny actually is. So just give a taste of that, please, for the people watching.
Yeah, well, I think where my piece that kind of captured the imagination of quite a few people that went viral, so to speak. I think it was placed on Revolver News, Revolver.news, Darren Beatty's aggregation site. And that was just a very, very simple piece where I looked at official British government data about the vaccine. And I showed that while, at that stage it was still being, or it was about to be mandated to stop spread and stop transmission. And I pointed out that there's a high proportion of people who are supposedly being hospitalized for COVID. But, who knows what actually happened in these hospitals? No one was really allowed to go in. And a high proportion of those people, and we saw similar stats in South Africa, were vaccinated people. So it was this overt lie that was very easy to see through, if you wanted to see through it, and that's kind of that and the July riots piece kind of formed just a basic accompaniment of how to go back to the Sam Francis term, that the liberal post-1990 state, so-called end of history, which has turned out to be a myth, was that was this accompaniment of heavy policing, big government, lots of regulation, all couched within the rhetoric of we're entering this period of what a phrase that conspiracy theorists, again in inverted commas, seized upon in a speech by George H.W. Bush Sr., his so-called New World Order speech. And in his New World Order speech, he spoke about open minds, open borders, open trade. But in actual fact, we feel more smothered than ever before in a kind of a liberal, that we use it kind of glibly, the nanny state, and that's exactly what it is. It's a matriarchal, stultifying state, and eventually now what we've seen is young people, particularly young men, when it reached that ultimate concentrated form of COVID and the attack on youth, we saw through it, so to speak. A great number of us saw through it, and particularly young people, not only young people, where we realized actually the things that are open, the things that are liberal, are the places where we want order, and the places in our lives where we want freedom and exploration and joy are the things which are being shut down. So that kind of formed a large part of when I started writing on Substack, and I think that struck a chord.
Yeah, and there's so much to this. So I spoke to Oren McIntyre recently, who works for The Blaze in America. I'm not sure whether his interview will be before yours or after, but he has this concept called the total state, which is exactly what
Yeah.
you are describing, where liberal democracy and Bolshevism, for lack of a better term, actually end up in the same place, just through different means. One is through coercion and one is through so-called human rights. But the human rights actually deracinate people so much they become economic cogs in an economic zone, and life gets very boring very quickly, and then you can tell them what to think. You can censor speech that the total state doesn't like. And I think you're describing exactly the same thing. On that note, though, I read another piece by N.S. Lyons, which I have recommended quite a few times. I'll link it down below. And he argues that this concept of the open society, this concept of liberal democracy, is basically over with Trump 2.0. So, knowing all of that, what are your feelings about the nature of liberal tyranny, the total state? Do you think we are going to enter into a period of time, a so-called golden age, where these things fall apart in front of our eyes? Or do you think it's actually rather strong and will continue?
Yeah, I think Oren McIntyre's, I haven't read the book, but I think the one of the major ideas that I can surmise from his short form pieces are the idea, exactly what you said, of deracination, that you think that multiculturalism will bring tolerance and pluralism and freedom, but because you have all these differing narratives, differing ideas of what civilized life is, the state has to grow to manage this, because there's no consensus on what the good life is. There's no consensus of what civilized behavior is or how the market should work. And I think one of the great insights that has come through in this time of seeing through these things has been, or what I've certainly found really enlightening is some of the notorious Bronze Age perverts work. And I think one of his insights that struck me the most was his take on the Cold War and how this is all historically situated, where the Cold War, according to him, and I think he's right, is largely fake. And I think we particularly see how that worked in South Africa. Ernst Roots and Tucker Carlson spoke about it this week, that you have a communist-backed ANC, but the West puts them in power. And we saw that throughout Africa. There were differing views of what the liberated post-World War II liberal state should look like. But Marxism and liberalism, or certainly New Dealism, were ideological cousins. And so when it all ended, when the kind of ideological struggle ended, this almost like these religious wars, you just got, you ended up with what McIntyre talks about, which is the total state, the therapeutic state, as Paul Gottfried calls it, where it turns out that individualism always leads to statism. And the great South African writer on this is Professor Koos Malan, and he just wrote a piece on Politics Web called "A Return to Paleo-Conservatism," and kind of, are we in a kind of revolutionary moment where some of the presuppositions of what we saw in the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which are far more connected than we think, are now being questioned. Some people have called it the return of the strong gods. That actually the best way to have freedom is to be a people, because if you don't have those layers between you and the state, you end up just with the exact thing, the total state. And I think what's really interesting for us in South Africa and in Africa is just how this has happened for us in such a concentrated fashion. We are the DEI, the woke state, where where these things are pushed most overtly.
Yes, and this is something I've written about as well on the website Undercurrents, if you want to go check that out. And essentially, I think from the 80s, South Africa already was becoming an open society, right? A lot of the very stupid separation laws were being repealed. By 1991, once Mandela's out of prison, we were basically the open society, and 94 just put down the hammer on the open society. And after 94, what happened? Every single nefarious US aid NGO in the world just flooded into the market, banned guns, banned excellence, banned private property rights. Everything that could possibly have happened within a very short period of time. And I would argue that the ANC really wasn't in control of any of that for the most part. But on the other hand, if the ANC was in total control, I think it would be Venezuela at the moment. So it's a bit difficult to make the argument about which one is better. But post 94 especially, you can just feel the total state just coming in entirely through policy, through laws, through behaviors. But the one thing that we have in South Africa is that the people put into places in these institutions have destroyed these institutions, whether it be literacy generation or even the justice system. Completely dysfunctional, completely inept, and alternatives have been built mostly by the Afrikaners. So again, South Africa is the pioneer state in terms of we had an open society for 25 years, and the alternatives have already been built to that. So it really is a catch-22 in the scenario. It really is. In the first episode of this podcast, I asked Rob Dugan, what is Trump 2.0 looking like for South Africa? He still needs a total state to effect his mandate, but he's doing a lot to dismantle some of the worst elements of it. What are your views on what Trump is doing? Is it a golden age? Should we be worried? Or, what do you think just generally?
Yeah, it's just to go back to what you said about like the open society in South Africa. I mean, something which has always puzzled me in Africa is you see this legislation being written, whether it's NHI or just the Constitution of South Africa or the Constitution of any African state, and no one ever pauses to ask, well, who wrote that? There's just no ways that there's these ANC cadres writing these laws. They don't writing this legislation, and I'll probably be called racist for that, but who is writing these laws? And when it comes to like the open society, we something Rob has mentioned quite a few times recently is Helen Ziller, kind of the leading mind behind opposition to the ANC, Democratic Alliance, liberal opposition. She quite skillfully elides over her background in Soros, in the literal open society foundation. It comes from outside. A lot of this stuff. It's not African. And then the African part of it that you see is that is the inability to maintain kind of the institutions which are mandated or implied by the Constitution, by these legislation. But that's probably, it looks like Britain's catching up in terms of incompetence. It looks like there's places in America where cities, you could be in South Africa with part of them. I remember a train trip from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris into Paris Center. I was horrified. I felt like I was in Kinshasa for some of the places. It was probably worse than I remember catching the train in Cape Town. When it comes to Trump, I always think of Trump. I was thinking about it this week that sorry, I've got some people walking past outside who've been very loud, but ignore them. When I think about Trump, there's that thing he said in his first term where all the Russiagate stuff, and I think it was one of the Fox News guys was saying, you've spoken about talking to Putin, you've spoken about negotiating with him, that you've got a good relationship with him. How can you do that? Putin's a killer. And Trump said, do you think we're so innocent? What makes you think
Uh,
we're so innocent?
we
And
killed far more people. Yeah, I remember that.
yeah, yeah, and to me that is just it's such a people talk about his character and he's vulgar, and I mean, not compared to what? Compared to Bill Clinton? Yeah, compared to who? Lyndon Johnson? But that's like quite a spiritual insight, But other American leaders, it's still city on a shining hill, and yeah, he still talks like that. But that insight, it kind of repositions, if you think about it, America as another country, America as a great power, as opposed to this rules based order, NATO and World Health Organization and all of that. So I think he's really important as a symbol, but I think it's important to remember he's still within that system. I think he opens up space for different questions to be asked. Um, and I think there's real wins in terms of getting government off the backs of young people, particularly young men. Like, let's build stuff, let's go into space, let's and it's the same with the Argentinian guy Malay. I'm not a huge fan of Malay. I'm not a huge fan of like the philosophical grounding. I like Trump more because he has less of that philosophical grounding, which I think is better. But Malay, just if you think of those, there's no reason why Argentina shouldn't be wealthy, where people shouldn't, have a sense of freedom in their lives.
Yeah.
So I think
I mean, it
that's
was.
the positive side for Trump. Yeah.
I mean, Argentina was the wealthiest nation in 1900, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Venezuela was wealthy also in the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, and the decline is planned, one could say, or chosen. Um, but from a South African perspective, we are in the news more recently. Ernst went to go see Tucker. Great interview, phenomenal interview, I would say. I think Ernst is someone who really understands what's going on, and most importantly, which is rare, he understands his history,
Yeah.
his personal history. You can say his ninth generation grandfather was here doing this, and his fourth generation grandfather was doing that, and that builds the character we know as Adam's roots. And I'm very keen to see what he's going to do now that he's left the official organizations that he used to work for. But at a time of last year of great pessimism and then optimism with the GNU, which faded very quickly, um, do you find that perhaps now is the time for South Africa to really, or South Africans rather, like this is a defining time in our history, arguably one of the most important ones. We don't know where it's going to go, but I'm optimistic. Like, what are you feeling?
Yeah. So as you know, I'm not currently in South Africa. So you hesitate to be to be too diagnostic, but I pay taxes in South Africa still, and most of my family, besides my immediate families in South Africa, some extended family in other places. My wife's extended family is mostly in Zimbabwe, which is interesting. I just don't know. I mean, you look at. I saw something on X where they looked at economic growth versus unemployment, and how I think we need the South African economy needs to grow at something close to 4% just to keep unemployment stable, and the average has been less than 1%. What happens in a country, a wealthy country, because when you're in other parts of Africa, even parts of Europe, as up from what I've heard, like New Zealand, you come back to South Africa and you realize South Africa is a wealthy country. People live very well in South Africa. There's just beautiful places. There's people do really well. People do well in business. People do well in life. Now, what happens in a place like that where you have over 50% official unemployment, let alone so that makes me quite pessimistic. at the same time, I know you and a lot of people are optimistic about, well, actually, South Africa, because you've got an incompetent state, then that gives you space to maneuver. You still, a lot of first world people wouldn't believe this, but you're still in a quasi-communist state. South Africans probably have a greater sense of personal freedom, even with all of the nonsense, BEE and all of that. There's a greater sense of personal freedom, I think, than in many first world countries. Certainly,
Correct.
European country, I felt watched. The police are like in your space. That's an interesting thing. I just can't predict it. It is interesting, like what you said about Ernst, about he has a situatedness in history, and that's what I think makes South Africa important, in that it has a European community in Africa, and a European community in Africa that is more vibrant, more vitalistic than probably most other European communities within Europe itself. And that's that's where I went next, kind of after I'd written about these kind of social happenings, social events, contemporary events, where I wrote the book about my own personal history, not because I'm a very interesting person, but speaking about Ernst, and this is something I think we have in common, is South Africa's in the news a lot, but a lot of people just aren't aware of, what you would call Anglo-South Africans, English South Africans, that, you saw even in Trump's executive order, Afrikaners who's suffering under kind of BEE laws. But of course, we know the law treats English-speaking South African, white English-speaking South Africans and white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans exactly the same. When our so-called leaders sing "Kill the Boer," they mean you and me too. Obviously, actual farmers are also targeted, but even those farmers are not. I know of so many, perhaps because I'm from Natal, which is more English, know of so many Anglo farmers who've been attacked. There's no differentiation between that. So that's something I'm personally quite interested in. Is we know that Afrikaners have that kind of thickness. Not all of them, but a lot of them. The sense of peoplehood, to folk. What about Anglo-South Africans? What about people like you and me, and not just South Africans but Africans? The European diaspora throughout Africa. What are we going to make of our identity, of our way of life outside of Europe? And what interests, another interesting part of that is both you and I don't know about you, but I don't have actually much British blood, despite being Anglo. I think of a mutual friend of ours, Russell Lamberti, Italian. My surname is Swiss German. Yours is French.
Correct.
So it's interesting how we occupy this kind of like strange space where we are considered Anglo, even though we're not British. But in a certain sense, I think we're like flag bearers of a certain civilization, of a certain culture, which maybe the seeds of its future are to be found outside of Europe itself.
I fully agree, and it also confounded me, this idea of like sort of Anglo South Africans. I mean, there's a fair number of them. I think there's well over 1 million, if not a bit more than
Millions.
that. I think, millions. And I know Natal farmers well. I know Anglo farmers relatively well as well. But there's always this weird cultural sense that collectivizing is like sort of not who we are. I think there's that liberal instinct. It's like, you make your way in the world as a individual, as a family. You can go to church, you can do everything, but to act collectively, it's just not what we do. And I think you find that here, you find that in a lot of areas where Anglos do exist. And in fact, you find in Britain, even they don't collectively do anything. I mean, they vote for the worst person possible as prime minister.
Yeah.
Like they vote against they vote against their best interests completely. But there is something within the Anglo mindset that's like just anti-collectivism. And I suppose, I mean, I was one of those people. Everyone goes through a libertarian phase or something like that, and you look back and you get embarrassed. But the real world is collectivism is what drives action, right? Individuals get killed inside the road and no one cares. You have to be a collective to do something. But there's something inherent within the culture that prevents that from happening. And I don't know what it is.
Yeah, there's something about the historical Anglo way of life that lent itself to liberalism. And I think the problem that came about was when after World War II, people try to universalize that and not recognize, well, that's actually a way of life which arose in a particular time and place. And was most notably transported to the United States. And there's this idea, well, America kind of invented limited democratic government from scratch, but the revolution was fighting for their rights as Englishmen. Actually, you can't tax me if I have no say in it. I'm far away, and you can't just govern me arbitrarily. I have rights where I am, and those were the rights of an Englishman. And then you could see how that's been twisted to the point of, well, we could try and, America's an idea, and that's kind of shorthand for everyone can live like an English liberal. But I think it works in a particular kind of culture with a particular kind of view of the world. It's got roots in geography and climate and everything that goes into human life. And you can't just, I think Liberia has the same constitution as America, written constitution, but is it American? It doesn't look, it's Liberia, it's where the slaves went. Monroeville's named after the American president, but they've got English surnames in Liberia, but it doesn't translate because we're not interchangeable units. We're born into a bloodline. I can trace I've got forefathers who arrived in South Africa in about 1680, way before the American Revolution, and they've spent time in South Africa, which is merged with my Swiss background, Irish background. Those were Germans, my earliest South African ancestors. And I think, like you say, what people who share similar sentiments to us around the world are realizing, well, that counts. That you don't just happen to be born into a certain body. Like, your body is who you are, and your body carries blood, carries ideas, carries history, and there's a natural connection through time and space that makes us who we are. So that's an exciting part about where we're living. I think in the 90s and the 80s, this was dead. No one was allowed to think this way. But we're definitely entering a new way of thinking, and people are doing it. It's quite mysterious. All around the world, people are thinking and feeling these same things.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, I actually read a book more recently about genetics and the history of different populations around the world and genetics. And the thing is, genetics are the same for everyone. Everyone has the same genes. They just have different mutations based on different contexts, geographical areas. And those mutations determine the civilization that arises out of it. So there's a specific chapter on Jewish genetics. And the Jews don't intermarry for the most part. So there's a straight line for 5, 10, 15,000 years, which makes the Jews a very particular type of people, which can't be replicated anywhere else, in the way that they got very high IQ for numeracy, but very low visuospatial awareness. So Jews are terrible hunters but excellent money counters, right? Or excellent whatever the case might be. So yeah, it's weird that we're finding out that people are distinct, right? People are really distinct, and that should be something that we've been trying to paper over for a century, and I think it's coming to the fore that no, people are different, and it's perfectly valid and perfectly fine, and we need to find systems that make them validate themselves in equal measure to anyone else. The idea that you could go to Zulu King and say, oh, what the Inkonyama Trust needs is like a liberal constitution, they'll laugh you out of the room, right? Rightly so. Same as you go to Orania, I suppose. Same as you go to the Cape Flats, where coloured people stay. You need different forms of governance that suits those people. It's silly having a overarching governance that reflects the ideas of people from 1800 in rural England, and this must somehow conform to the rest of the world. It's an insane proposition, and I'm hoping that is going to be in fact the case. It will be absurd.
I've read, all of those. John Locke, massively influential in terms of, the sovereign individual who contracts with the state and who owns his own body and so forth. Apparently, I haven't read a lot of those guys. I should have read more, but apparently there's this assumption throughout. Look, I'm only talking about Anglo-Saxons. I'm only talking. This doesn't apply to everybody because this
That's
is
completely true.
Who we are. Yeah,
they were talking about. They were talking about middle class mercantilists who were Christians.
Yeah. And they couldn't fathom, none of them would have fathomed of let's set this up in Africa, let's set this up in Asia, or let's open our borders and let's have everybody living under our system, even though they've got a completely different view of the world, completely different genetics, even. And, to go back to Koos Milan, I really always recommend his book, There Is No Supreme Constitution. And he begins by looking at the word constitution. Because if you think about it, how you apply it personally, it refers to your physical and personal makeup, how you are constituted. And a lot of what he is saying is, we'll actually apply that to the political realm, because there's the constitution on paper, but then there is how the state is actually constituted. And if I've interpreted him correctly, like a healthy state, the constitution, or what is written, should match with what is real. How is the state really constituted? And so South Africa, you've got this complete mismatch between what life is like on the ground and how people live, and then with what is mandated constitutionally, and then with how that constitution is interpreted, because that's a completely different thing to what's written on the pieces of paper. So in order to overcome this discordance to go back to being an Anglo-African, Anglo-South African as opposed to an Afrikaner, is we need a thicker sense of our own personal collective constitution. Who are we? What are we doing here? How did we get here? What is our place here? How is our culture specific to us? And what do we offer in this journey of European man? What do we contribute as it does seem we kind of enter into a winter if I'm going to get all Spenglerian on us.
But it's funny we don't ask this about the Saudis or the Chinese or the Japanese or the South Koreans. We don't say, what is a South Korean? No, we just accept that who they are. We accept that Saudi will produce or proceed with whatever gives it the most power for the Saudi people. The only experiment in the Middle East is, in fact, the Emirates. And it's very clear. If you're a Dubai citizen, here are the benefits. If you're an immigrant, you need to produce X, Y, Z value, but you'll never become equal at all. You can become a cog in the economic zone, but you'll never be part of the root culture of Dubai. Yeah. So we accept this for everyone else, except for somehow sort of white people. And I find that weird. I think there's something inherent in liberalism that just has seeds of doubt all over it. And I think it's very easy to undermine and to use against the idea of what it means to be sort of a white person or a white Anglo or an Afrikaner or a whatever, a Southern Appalachian. It's only a Western thing where there's this doubt about identity. And it just befuddles me. I think it should be quite
I
obvious.
think it's particularly an Anglo thing. And I think this is maybe, I've read a lot of Nietzsche, and I did some academic work on Nietzsche, and I think this is one of the things he was getting at, where he said we need to be, he considers himself a good European, and that idea is completely being subverted by the EU. But the idea of a united Europe was something that Nietzsche wrote about a lot, and the idea being that maybe we shouldn't just consider ourselves Spanish or Germanic or English without denying those things, but we need to, in an age of great politics and grand politics, Europeans need each other, need to see themselves as part of a broad collective, something which I suppose you got in the Holy Roman Empire. And I think maybe that's something that Anglos in particular need to lean into more, that they're part of Europe. And Europeans need to claim that for themselves too, because they've been so influenced and occupied by America. You mentioned South Korea.
Correct.
South Korea is like ultimate cuck country. I mean, cuck not in shit, but
I know.
I've got a friend who lived there for many years, and he was telling me that the male makeup market, for your face, makeup, is bigger than the female. And then you wonder, American troops being there, does that have to, what does that have to do with that? South Africa, we've got a civil rights constitution. So when Europeans are complaining about Trump saying, fund your own defense, we've got an ocean, that's great for Europe, because that's what Europe needs. And I think European diaspora needs in Africa and around the world. Become who you are, like find your own identity again, and cast off the yoke which this, post World War II human rights UN kind of consensus has bestowed on us.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. And I'm really looking forward to the day NATO disappears completely, i.e., Trump or JD Vance stops funding it, because that's all it is, right? It's American hegemony over Europe. After World War II, they said, we can't actually trust you Europeans, you maniacs, you lose to the Germans all the time. So we're going to neuter the Germans completely, but we're going to neuter all of you collectively against the big bad, Soviet Union. So we made a deal with the Soviet Union, which apparently is a much better deal than making with fascists, even though I can't tell the difference between the two, except one killed a lot more than the other. And at the end of the day, I mean, the Europeans have just been, as you say, cucks of America, cucks of the global American empire for the past 80 years. And they love it. That's the worst part of it. Like, they love it. And JD Vance, the vice president, makes a very good point. It's like, listen, Germany, we fund your entire defense force, and you're locking up people for praying? Not going to happen, guys. I'm hoping it does happen, though.
I mean, I've met kind of in my time spent outside of South Africa the last few years, I've met a lot of British people, and it's a black pill, because, probably the ones you meet outside of Britain might be the ones who blackpill you, but sometimes I just think to myself, you know what, maybe it's just game over for you guys. I know Peter Hitchens says the same thing, and he gets a lot of flack for it, but it's just like, maybe you deserve what's coming to you, because some of the stuff, like I had a British person, an acquaintance of mine, say to me the other day, with the whole South African American thing, they're cutting aid to South Africa. Why don't you take them to like the international court to sue them or whatever? And I said, it's That's aid, great. It's charity. Like, this is an educated person, and there's this assumption that like we have a right to American LGBT funding or like feminism funding or vaccine funding. And,
Yeah.
the same guy was telling me how amazing it is that the net zero movement in Europe, because they're creating all these new jobs, and he could, and this is not just one person, let me just be clear that when I've spoken to people like this and I said to them, you do realize that your GDP per capita, and your Germany is still slightly better because they've focused on keeping some industry, but GDP per capita in like any European country is lower than Mississippi. So they will go on about, they'll mock JD Vance, you're from Ohio or Kentucky, and Mississippi's like the poorest American state, and they'll mock them for, oh, you redneck Christian, Trump's got all of these weird Christian snake handling, anti-abortion followers, which is completely, not it's not true. He probably won because he recaptured the Catholic vote. So it's not that's often the key demographic in terms of religion. Mad Mississippi's richer than your country. It's richer
Yeah.
than England. It's richer than France. It's so find some self-respect, find some backbone again. And what's interesting, I think, for us in Africa is this is something, and I thought of it just before I joined you on this. There's this moment in Nietzsche's book Dawn of Day, it's sometimes called, when he's talking about socialistic rat catchers and what it's like to be a worker in Europe. But then he goes on to the colonies, and I think this is important for people like you and me. And I'm just going to read it's a bit of a quote, so just forgive me. But it's Nietzsche, so it's great to read. So this is from Dawn. This is aphorism number 206. And he writes, "May Europe be freed from 1/4 of her inhabitants. Both she and they will experience a sensation of relief. It is only far in the distance, in the undertaking of vast colonizations, that we shall be able to observe how much rationality, fairness, and healthy suspicion Mother Europe has incorporated in her sons. These sons who could no longer endure life in the home of the dull old woman, always running the danger of becoming as bad-tempered, irritable, and pleasure-seeking as she herself. The European virtues will travel along with these workmen far beyond the boundaries of Europe, and those very qualities which on their native soil have begun to degenerate into a dangerous discontent and criminal inclinations will, when abroad, be transformed into a beautiful savage naturalness and will be called heroism, so that at last a purer air would again be wafted over this old, overpopulated and brooding Europe of ours. The home of the dull," that's the end of the quote, the home of the dull old woman. He's writing that in the late 19th century. Imagine what he would think now if he thought Europe was a dull old woman then. What would he think now? And the idea is incredible that he's talking about the working class in Europe, and he's saying, you know what, life might be better for you outside of Europe. And what's more, you can keep some of our European virtues alive. You'll be able to show us again what we've got. And instead of it being degenerate virtues, they'll be transformed into something beautiful and a little bit savage. And I don't know about you, but that is something when you meet people who share our ethnicity but haven't grown up how we've grown up, that kind of beautiful savagery is something which is so South African, so European African, which so I think there's
Correct.
like the real destiny for us. That when I wrote, was talking about the book Rage and Love, my kind of self-indulgent memoir. But that was what I was trying to get at is value this. People who have our background value this. We have this beautiful savagery. We've been forged in a kind of African fire, and it's incredible how I think Nietzsche foresaw this.
I think it is incredible. So I speak to my father, and I actually, this was a while ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and I said, you know what, thank you for coming here. Right? 'Cause my father was one of the savages. in in Europe. It's like you just found it so stifling. You're like, I cannot anymore. Let's go somewhere. And he came to South Africa like in the early 90s. And I was thinking to myself, imagine I was born in France and I still live there now. What would I be doing today? Here, I can be shooting my guns at the shooting range. I could go hunting, meet my friends for coffee. I could drive my 4x4. I could do anything I want. In France, I would be maybe sitting at the cafe having an espresso and complaining about like pension reform or like endlessly scrolling on TikTok or uh, I don't know, or joining a group that's like sort of anti-immigration, but it gets shut down very quickly because of like some spicy WhatsApp group chats. It is a terrible existence in modern
Yeah,
Europe.
I mean,
It
I'm sure there's
is.
great pockets. There's great pockets, you know, especially the French probably because of Charles de Gaulle kind of being a little bit more based than other European leaders. I think I, I I've spent minimal time there, but I'm sure that there's something there still. But you know, my parallel story is talking to my own dad about, you know, in the 90s when there's all the chaos before the election, and like many white South Africans, he thought, well, do we go to Australia? And I remember having this conversation. We were in Joburg. I think we were even in like Boksburg. It was like a bizarre setting, and you know, not a great place in the world, not a great place in South Africa, especially now. And I said exactly the same thing to him. I said, imagine you'd gone to Australia. Imagine I'd gone to. That's far worse than I think staying in France. I think Australia is just you know, there's this pretense, and I hate to tarnish whole people because they're not all like that, but the general narrative, the general social structure is yeah, we're these rough edged, rugged Australians, and it's really not. They're like so
No.
obsessed, even worse than England in many cases, so obsessed with safety and all of those things, and also, you know, it's a word which, you know, you have to be aware of what it really means at its core, but degenerate. Like when I was at high school, there was an exchange program with Australian schools, and everyone wanted to go because the girls were loose in Australia. And, you know, what an indictment is that? And I mean, it's not like when I'm a teenager in South Africa that girls are prude here. But you can only imagine then what Australians were like. And these are posh private schools. So yeah, there is something we can be so grateful for.
Yeah. So in 2006, I ended school, and my father's like, you know what? Let's go visit Vancouver because it's Canada, but it's not America, right? America is like degenerate. Canada is still sort of Anglo. So my sister goes to Vancouver. She comes back. Oh, I love it. It's so great, so wonderful. You can walk around, you have your coffee, whatever. Okay, cool. Except the food's terrible. I said, okay, fine. And then she gets started on the process, like to go to Vancouver and like to study there, perhaps, or whatever the case might be. So after a year or two of this, I say, okay, fine, I'll go to Vancouver. I'll just take a look around. The most miserable 10 days of my life. Awful place, always raining, miserable, strip malls everywhere. You have to sit inside because it's raining and then it's snowing and then it's sunshine and then it's raining again. And people are like, oh, you know, and I met some South Africans, oh, we're so happy here. So you've been paying off your house for 40 years and you haven't finished. It's just a miserable existence. Like the modern Western world is a miserable existence completely. Maybe certain parts of America is quite nice and whatever the case might be, but overall, as a sort of Anglo-European, and I'm French, not even Anglo, I struggle to think that many people my age and with my disposition could reach the heights that I have, from like YouTuber to chief of staff to maybe not chief of staff 2 months later. But it can only happen here. It really sort of cannot happen anywhere else.
You're downplaying yourself. The greatest ever government bureaucrat, Roman. That's what you became.
I still am, by the way. I still am.
Hey, you still are.
When,
Yeah, you still
yeah,
are.
of course, of course. I mean, I was asked, and I
Fantastic.
said no, and then that's it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you spoke about, you mentioned coffee there, and as you know, I spent a year in Switzerland, Lake Geneva, beautiful. Not all of it beautiful. It's interesting. It's in layers. The inner part of like the towns and even the cities, beautiful, beautiful. Then you have these disgusting suburbs outside, and then you get into the more country areas, and those are beautiful again. But I was in rural Natal, which in Africa, and I could say to myself, I really feel like really good coffee, and I could go to a neighbor's house and he would make me great coffee. I could go to my favorite coffee place was next to a spa, like not even a nice spa down the road in like a parking lot, and it's sensational coffee. I'm wandering around Lake Geneva and I'm picturing myself, I'm going to get it's the French part of Switzerland. I'm going to get a croissant. I'm going to get a nice coffee. I'm going to sit at the lake. And the only coffee you can find is those electric, like espresso machines, where you just press a
I,
button. And
yes.
and I'm like, how is this possible? Like, I'm in Europe, Lake Geneva, and I can't find a cup of coffee that matches what I get in rural Natal. Like, what has happened in my life? So, it's incredible, and I think that's to go back to that line, that aphorism from Nietzsche. That's what I keep coming back to is what does it mean when a person at rural Natal can find a better like, okay, I know it's not originally from Europe, but like something which is like you always associate with Europe. What I can find that in a random part of South Africa, better than I can find it in parts of Europe itself. And again, sweeping statement, but you would expect like a nice cafe on the shore of Lake Geneva. And I mean, I went to Lucerne, same thing. And I think that's quite a nice metaphor. Um, yeah, and something I go back to in the book Rage and Love. My great fear is how long that's going to take a lot of fighting to maintain, a lot of fighting
Correct.
because there is chaos on the horizon.
So just to finish off, let's talk about your book. As I mentioned before we started, I read it when it came out. I think it was a year or 18 months ago. So I must admit I've forgotten most of it. But what I do remember is that it is the
Very
first.
memorable.
No, 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 no. What I do remember of it is it's the first memoir of a conservative Anglo growing up in South Africa. There's lots of books about like communist whites or Jews. There's lots of things about like the rainbow whites, like Zach de Beer, whatever his name was. I forgot his name already. But this is the first one that's a sort of fairly conservative, you as a person, a conservative Anglo in South Africa. And the insights is when you read someone like, I forget his name, is it Ellen Payton? I can't remember. How great 94 was, or how fantastic that we have this constitution, how fantastic apartheid ended. You're not saying apartheid was great by any means, but you just say how chaotic this all is. Like that's the thing. It is utter chaos and has been for close to 5 decades in this country. And that's the one benefit of reading it. It's like, okay, we can look at what the news headline says and how great South Africa is, only, to be thought by Jacob Zuma somehow. It was only his fault, no one else. But you're saying, no, how chaotic it was. And I remember as a child, I was 6 years old in 1994, I remember that chaos. I remember patrolling the farm with a .22 firearm. I remember neighbors in bakkies going to like sort out a farm attack or medical aid or whatever the case might be, or put out burning tires down the road. I grew up in the south of Johannesburg, and there was a
Oh,
lot
wow.
of chaos. Yeah, and
Um,
your memoirs pricked up those memories for me as well.
yeah, I remember. Yeah, I was 8 in '94. Like one of my earliest memories is Mandela being released when I was 4 years old, and my mom talking about it with a neighbor. Um, And one of the anecdotes is in that 94 period is, we couldn't travel in certain. I was in Cape Town. You couldn't travel on certain roads in Cape Town because they were stoning cars, not just burning tires, but stoning people. I remember a minute of silence at school. I think it was 93, just because of the sheer chaos that was happening in the country. And the irony is, I talk about Alan Paton in the book because there's this he's a great writer. He's, he was, I think, naive in many ways. And if you go to, where's he from in Natal again? And he spent time in Maritzburg, that small town in rural, it'll come to me.
It's not Howick.
But he has there's that moment about life in suburban Johannesburg. And he talks about how as things continue to fall apart, we will live smaller lives. You won't be able to walk around at night. You won't come home a little bit drunk from the local pub and walk home under the stars to your house anymore. Everything will need to tighten up. And of course, the solution he always proposed, our parents, well, certainly my parents in South Africa had that. My dad would go out to Hillbrow at night, would walk through Durban city centre at night. It's become, the solution is worse. and maybe it's more palatable in terms of race, in terms of the kind of political framework, but it's utter chaos. And thanks for saying, about the Anglo stuff is we're seeing a lot of the world's attention paid on particularly the Afrikaner experience, and that's fantastic. I love the Afrikaans people, got lots of Afrikaans friends. But it is interesting how there is this slight gap where there is something unique about English South Africa, English white South Africa. There's, you just look at the heritage of the architecture that people like us have left behind in South Africa, the schools, the buildings. So that was also one of the things which I wanted to communicate, because it is a common misconception. I had a good Afrikaans friend in Switzerland, and some of our mutual acquaintances and friends would say, "Why are you speaking differently? What I don't understand. I thought you were the same." And I said, "No, well, actually, we have, we have a lot in common, and we get along well, and we understand each other, but we're actually different cultures, different languages, and I think particularly when you see so much distraction and decay in the Anglo world, I think the Anglo diaspora in Africa and in other places, can offer that Nietzschean beautiful savagery, that reminder of what Europe was. And that was part of the motivation for it.
Yeah, I highly recommend it, even if I may downplay inadvertently. But when I read it,
right,
I remember. I remember reading it over the course of a day or two, and I was very enamored with it. And then, there's too much information in the world to pay too much attention. Yeah. But I will link it down in the show notes. And Chris, all I can say is thank you. I don't think there is any solution or resolution to the show. It's a conversation. I really enjoyed this one. If people want to reach out to you or to read your work, I suspect Substack or X is the best option there.
Yeah. So Substack is just chriswaldburger.substack.com. Chris Waldburger on X, and then the book Rage and Love. Or you can just search for my name on Amazon, or for South Africans, it's still easier to use Take-A-Lot for print copies. Yeah.
Perfect. And all that will be linked down below. Chris, thank you so much. What an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Roman, for having me.
All right. Speak soon.